Right, so organisms are subjected to the temperatures presented by their environment. Thus, they need to be able to regulate their body temperatures. You're already familiar with warm and cold-blooded organisms. However, it's not just animals that regulate body temperatures. Plants do it too, and we'll discuss this later on. Although I gave you some examples therein in the intro, the one with I forgot the name of the plant. What was it again? Oh, the Welwitschia. There we go. Anyway, let's first describe or discuss heat budget. Okay? An organism's heat budget describes the balance between heat loss and heat gain. So why is knowing this important? Well, this is because depending on the environment, heat is continually lost or continually gained. Okay? So as such, an organism must be able to offset heat loss or heat gain in order to maintain optimal body temperatures. For example, this picture here, a beluga. So belugas are suited for Arctic temperatures and they must balance heat loss from the environment and heat gain through metabolism. Okay? So belugas have certain adaptations to minimize heat loss like thick blubber for insulation beneath their skin and specialized blood flow in their fins. Okay, so let's discuss the specialized blood flow that they have. So without the modifications that their fins and flippers have, their flippers will be cold. So this is offset by the process that we'll discuss now. So blood flowing from the body into the flipper, this one. Okay, this blood flowing from the body into the flipper will be the warmest since it comes from the animal's core. As it moves through the flipper, okay, temperature drops since it becomes more exposed to water. Why? Because flippers are thinner than the body. So the surface area to volume ratio is different for this one, making it more exposed to surrounding water, which means that it loses heat faster. Okay? But the flipper's blood flow is designed in such a way that the blood flowing back to the body, this one, okay, is placed next to warm blood flowing from the body into the flipper. So this, okay, this means that this warmer blood shares its heat with the colder blood that's flowing back into the body from the flipper itself. Okay, so this prevents the flipper from losing too much temperature. And as this happens, it also prevents the blood that flows back into the body from being too cold. Because if it's too cold, then it also runs the risk of lowering the body's core temperature. By the way, this doesn't just happen in belugas. Pretty much all cetaceans that are found in cold areas also employ this type of blood flow for their flippers. So the heat budget can be described via heat gain and heat loss. So there's a certain equation, as is shown in the photo here, that describes the balance between gain and loss. Okay? So it's Hs, which is an organism's total heat, equal to Hm, which is heat gain through metabolism or metabolic heat. So that's the metabolic heat that's released through cellular respiration. Plus minus HCD, which is heat loss or heat gain through conduction. So conduction refers to the transfer of heat between objects. So for example, you are sitting on hot sand. So that's obviously heat gain. So that's plus HCD. For example, another example, you're sitting on ice. Then you lose heat to ice, right? So that's minus HCD. Next, we have HCV, which is heat gain or heat loss through convection. Oh, sorry, it happened. There. So again, we have HCV, which is heat gain or heat loss through convection. So convection refers to the transfer of heat from an object to a fluid or a fluid to an object. Fluid in this case doesn't necessarily need to be a liquid. Okay, so it can be air. Well, it can also be water sometimes. Okay, so it's the transfer of heat from air to organism or water to organism. So that's HCV. And then we have HR, which is heat gain or heat loss through radiation. In most cases, this is radiation from the sun. So this is from sunlight. And finally, we have minus HE, which is heat loss through evaporation. Why does an organism lose heat when water evaporates? Remember, evaporation absorbs heat. We mentioned that earlier. Thus, it lowers the organism's temperature. Okay? So with that in mind, organisms have different ways of adapting to the temperatures found in their respective environments. For example, when mammals sweat, it's either usually when it's too hot, right? Why did I say either? There's no either. Mammals sweat when it's hot, okay? And shiver when it's too cold. So these two activities are just examples of ones that help lower or raise the body's temperature based on the organism's needs. Alright, so let's first discuss endotherms, which are warm-blooded organisms. Again, I don't know what happened to this. This isn't supposed to be the slide. So let's just discuss endotherms. Okay? Endotherms are organisms that can produce their own heat. Okay? So this usually happens through cellular respiration. The process of cellular respiration produces heat in the cells of these organisms, which it then uses to raise its internal body temperatures. So what are examples of endotherms? We have mammals, birds, and some other odd organisms here and there. Okay? Some insects, for example, are considered to be endotherms. Next, let's discuss ectotherms. So ectotherms use external sources of energy to reach optimal temperatures. We mentioned before that crocodiles and other lizards are examples of ectotherms. Okay? So most reptiles, fishes are ectotherms. So these usually have behavioral adaptations and modifications that allow them to gain heat from the environment. So some examples of these behavioral modifications include basking under the sun or orienting themselves in such a way that they receive less sunlight or more sunlight depending on what their temperature needs are. So crocodiles and many other reptiles do this. A lot of insects also use the orientation method to gain more or less sunlight. So let's discuss thermoregulation in desert plants. We mentioned earlier that it's not just animals that thermoregulate, right? So desert plants usually have waxy leaves to prevent water loss. And these surfaces are usually waxy in order to lower heat gain from the sun. The leaves themselves are usually oriented in a parallel manner so that the sun just hits the sides of the blade and not the broad base of the blade or broad face of the blade itself, thereby also lowering heat gain. So aside from modifications that prevent heat gain from the sun, okay, these plants also usually have an open growth form, which means that their surfaces are exposed to wind. So this allows the plant to lose heat to wind through convection. Again, I'm saying usually a lot because there are still some exceptions. And finally, the growths of these plants are positioned in such a way that the tissues are kept away from the ground. This lowers heat gain from conduction because obviously the ground in deserts is very hot most of the time. So Arctic plants in many ways have the opposite modifications compared to desert plants. So their leaves are usually darkly pigmented. Remember that darker pigmentations allow surfaces to absorb more heat from the sun, and this, in Arctic plants, increases heat gain through radiation from the sun. So if desert plants orient their leaves parallel to sunlight to reduce contact, Arctic plants, on the other hand, reduce or orient their leaves perpendicular to the sun in order to increase the amount of leaf surface that the sun shines on. So they orient their leaf blades, the broad face of their leaf blades, towards the sun. Again, this increases heat gain. The growth form of these plants is usually very compact as opposed to the open growth form that desert plants have. So this compact growth form is usually close to the ground, which prevents heat loss from wind exposure. It also allows the plant to increase the heat it gains from the surroundings, okay, from the surrounding ground, which is exposed to the sun. So as was explained in the previous slides, organisms have different ways of adapting to the temperatures found in their respective environments. Some organisms, on the other hand, have to adapt to more extreme conditions. So the strategies previously mentioned are already adaptations to extremes. Many organisms, however, enter periods of activity when temperature extremes are concerned. So some animals and some plants induce resting states. Okay? So these resting states include hibernation and estivation, which are periods wherein animals reduce their metabolic rates. By the way, a common misconception is that animals only sleep when this happens. No, okay? They don't just sleep when they're hibernating or estivating. They can still enter waking periods, but just with low metabolic rates. Also, these are usually long-term and may last for many months. Okay? So the difference between estivation and hibernation is that estivation usually happens in the summer, whereas hibernation happens in the winter. Also, these two are triggered by the amount of sunlight available. So the animals are able to perceive the lengthening or the shortening of sunlight in one day, which triggers them to hibernate or estivate. Okay? Next, we have torpor. So torpor is a state where the animal also has reduced metabolic rates. Oh, and body temperatures, not just metabolic rates. So torpor is shorter term compared to hibernation and estivation. In fact, some animals undergo torpor daily, depending on what season it is. And it can be triggered by the temperature and surroundings. Okay, so periods of inactivity, these are also good adaptations. Okay, inactivity involves taking shelter and being inactive during daily periods of extreme temperatures. For example, a lot of desert insects hide when the sun is too hot and only come out when temperatures go down.